At 12:55 on the morning of February 3, 1943, a German torpedo struck the USAT Dorchester 300 miles off the coast of Greenland, tearing a hole 30 feet wide in the starboard side and flooding the engine room with seawater so cold it killed men in less than 2 minutes. The Dorchester was a converted luxury liner carrying 902 souls, American soldiers, merchant mariners, and civilian workers bound for a construction project in Greenland, now suddenly transformed into a sinking ship in the middle of the North Atlantic in February, when water temperature was 29 degrees and survival time was measured in minutes. Captain Hans Danielson knew immediately that his ship was dying. The torpedo had destroyed the engine room, knocked out electrical power, and flooded compartments so rapidly that watertight doors couldn't be closed. The Dorchester would sink in less than 20 minutes. 902 men needed to evacuate in 20 minutes, but the ship carried lifeboats for only 400, and many of those lifeboats were frozen to their davits or damaged by the torpedo blast. Men poured out of the interior compartments where they'd been sleeping, many without life jackets because the torpedo had struck without warning and there'd been no time to retrieve survival gear from storage lockers. In the chaos and darkness, 4 men moved through the tilting corridors with purpose and calm, organizing evacuation, directing men to lifeboat stations, helping wounded soldiers reach the deck, and giving away the one thing that might save their own lives. 4 Army chaplains, George Fox, Alexander Goode, Clark Poling, and John Washington, each from different faith traditions, each assigned to provide spiritual support to the troops aboard the Dorchester, now facing the test that would define their ministry and their lives. In the 18 minutes between the torpedo strike and the moment the Dorchester slipped beneath the waves, these 4 men would make a choice that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. A choice so clear and deliberate that it would become one of the most powerful stories of faith and sacrifice in American military history. Each chaplain removed his life jacket and gave it to a soldier who had none, knowing with absolute certainty that this meant death in freezing water, knowing there was no chance of survival, knowing they were choosing to die so others could live. And when the ship went down, witnesses reported seeing all 4 chaplains standing together on the sloping deck, arms linked, praying in their different traditions, still serving their men in the final moments as the North Atlantic closed over them. If this story moves you the way it moved us, if you believe that faith and sacrifice and choosing others over yourself deserves to be remembered, hit that like button right now because it tells YouTube these stories matter, and subscribe because we're bringing you the voices of courage that inspire us to be better, the men and women who showed us what it means to truly love your neighbor as yourself. Now let's go back and understand who these 4 chaplains were, how they came to be on that ship, and why their choice on February 3, 1943, created a legacy that transcended denominations and became a symbol of faith in action. George Lansing Fox was born on March 15, 1900, in Lewistown, Pennsylvania, the son of a clerk who worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad and a mother who raised 5 children on limited income during the early years of the 20th century. George grew up in a Methodist household where faith was practical and service-oriented, where Christianity meant helping your neighbor and living according to principles rather than just attending church on Sunday. In 1917, at age 17, George enlisted in the army to fight in World War I. He served in France as an ambulance driver and medical oarsman, earned 3 battle stars for service in major offensives, and returned home in 1919 having seen enough death and suffering to last a lifetime. But instead of being hardened by war, George felt called to ministry, called to help people find meaning in suffering, called to provide comfort to those facing death. He attended Moody Bible Institute in Illinois, earned his degree in theology, and was ordained as a Methodist minister in 1934. He married, had 2 children, served small congregations in Vermont, and by 1941 was 41 years old with a comfortable pastoral life. But when Pearl Harbor was attacked and America entered World War II, George felt the same call he'd felt in 1917. Men would go to war, men would die, and someone needed to be there to help them face death with faith and courage. He applied to become an Army chaplain in January 1942, was commissioned as a first lieutenant, and told his wife he had to go because the soldiers needed someone who understood war and understood God. Alexander Goode was born on May 10, 1911, in Brooklyn, New York, the son of a rabbi who served a Reformed Jewish congregation in Washington, D.C., Alexander grew up in a household where Jewish tradition was balanced with American identity, where faith meant both preserving heritage and embracing the country that had welcomed Jewish immigrants. Alexander attended the University of Cincinnati and Hebrew Union College. Following his father's path toward becoming a rabbi, he was ordained in 1937 at age 26 and took a position serving a small congregation in York, Pennsylvania. He married, had a daughter, and devoted himself to building a Jewish community in a town where Jews were a small minority, but Alexander also felt a broader calling, a belief that Jewish Americans needed to serve their country and prove their belonging in a nation where anti-Semitism still existed. When war came, Alexander applied to become an army chaplain. He believed Jewish soldiers needed rabbis who understood military life, who could provide kosher rations and conduct Jewish services in the field, and who could represent Jewish faith to a military that was overwhelmingly Christian. He was commissioned as an army chaplain in July 1942, one of only a handful of Jewish chaplains in the entire U.S. military. His father, also a chaplain in World War I, warned him that military chaplaincy was difficult and sometimes dangerous. Alexander replied that difficulty was exactly why he needed to do it. Clark Vandersall Poling was born on August 7, 1910, in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a prominent minister in the Reformed Church in America. Clark grew up in a household dominated by faith and social justice, where Christianity meant fighting for the poor and standing against injustice. Clark attended Hope College in Michigan and Rutgers Theological Seminary, was ordained as a minister in the Dutch Reformed tradition, and took a position at a church in Schenectady, New York, where he married and had a son. Clark was a social activist, believed the church should engage with political and economic issues, preached sermons about labor rights and racial justice that made some church members uncomfortable, but he believed that faith without action was meaningless. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Clark saw the war as a moral necessity, believed that Nazi Germany represented evil that had to be defeated, and felt called to serve as a chaplain because soldiers needed ministers who understood that faith required courage and sacrifice. He applied to become an army chaplain in early 1942, was commissioned in May, and wrote to his father that he was following in the family tradition of serving God by serving others. John Patrick Washington was born on July 18, 1908, in Newark, New Jersey, the seventh child of Irish Catholic immigrants. His father worked in construction. His mother raised 9 children in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood where the Catholic Church was the center of community life. John attended Catholic schools, felt called to priesthood as a teenager, and entered seminary at Immaculate Conception in Darlington, New Jersey, where he studied theology and prepared for ordination. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1935 at age 27 and assigned to St. Stephen's Church in Arlington, New Jersey, where he served working-class Catholics who struggled through the Great Depression. Father John, as everyone called him, was known for his compassion and his willingness to help anyone regardless of whether they attended his church. He ran food programs, helped unemployed men find work, and spent his own meager salary helping families who couldn't pay rent. When war came, Father John believed that Catholic soldiers needed priests who could provide sacraments and hear confessions in combat zones. He applied to become an army chaplain, was commissioned in November 1942, and told his parish that he was going to war because Catholic boys were going to war and they needed their church to go with them. 4 men, for different faith traditions, for different paths to military chaplaincy, brought together by assignment to the USAT Dorchester in January 1943. The USAT Dorchester was a former coastal passenger liner built in 1926 for luxury travel between New York and Miami. The ship was 368 feet long, could carry 314 passengers in comfortable staterooms, and featured dining rooms, lounges, and deck space designed for tourists enjoying warm weather cruises. But when war came, the Navy converted the Dorchester into a troop transport, stripped out the luxury furnishings, installed bunk beds stacked 4 high, and crammed as many soldiers as possible into spaces that had once held wealthy tourists. By early 1943, the Dorchester was making regular runs to Greenland, carrying troops and civilian workers to support the construction of air bases and weather stations that were critical for North Atlantic operations. On January 23, 1943, the Dorchester departed New York Harbor as part of a small convoy, 3 ships with Coast Guard cutter Comanche and cutter Tampa providing escort, heading north to Greenland with a cargo of 902 souls. Aboard were 751 soldiers, most assigned to construction battalions that would build facilities in Greenland, along with merchant mariners who crewed the ship and civilian workers contracted for construction projects. Also aboard were 4 Army chaplains who'd met for the first time when they reported for embarkation in New York: George Fox the Methodist, Alexander Goode the Rabbi, Clark Poling the Dutch Reformed minister, and John Washington the Catholic priest. The 4 chaplains were assigned to share a stateroom, military efficiency dictating that chaplains of different faiths could bunk together since they were all officers and all serving the same essential function. What began as a practical arrangement became something deeper. The 4 men discovered they shared fundamental beliefs about faith and service that transcended their theological differences. All 4 believed that ministry meant serving people in their darkest moments. All 4 believed that chaplains existed to provide comfort and courage to men facing death, and all 4 believed that faith was demonstrated through action rather than words. They spent the first days of the voyage conducting services for men of their respective faiths. George Fox held Protestant services, Alexander Goode conducted Jewish services, Clark Poling served Reformed church members, and Father John Washington celebrated Catholic Mass. But they also conducted interfaith gatherings where soldiers of all backgrounds could attend. They held discussions about faith and meaning, about fear and courage, about what it meant to believe in God when facing the possibility of death in combat or at sea. The men aboard the Dorchester responded to the chaplains with trust and affection. Soldiers who'd never met a rabbi attended Alexander Goode's services out of curiosity and stayed because his message about faith and community resonated. Catholic soldiers attended George Fox's Protestant services because his practical Christianity made sense to them. Protestant soldiers went to Father Washington's masses because his compassion was evident in everything he did. The 4 chaplains became known for their constant presence among the troops. They didn't stay in the officers' quarters, didn't maintain formal distance. Instead, they spent hours on the troop decks talking with soldiers, playing cards, listening to fears about what awaited them in Greenland or in combat theaters beyond. They also prepared soldiers for the reality of North Atlantic convoy operations. German U-boats were active in these waters, ships had been sunk, men had died, and the chaplains believed soldiers deserved to know the risks and to think about how they would respond if disaster struck. All 4 chaplains emphasized the same message: if the ship is torpedoed, stay calm, follow evacuation procedures, help your fellow soldiers, and remember that courage comes from faith and from caring for others more than yourself. They conducted lifeboat drills, made sure men knew where life jackets were stored, taught them how to properly wear and secure the jackets, and emphasized that survival in North Atlantic waters required keeping your head and helping others. One soldier later recalled George Fox telling him, "If we get hit and you survive, your job is to help other men survive. That's what faith means in a crisis. Not praying for yourself but acting to save others." Another soldier remembered Alexander Goode saying, "In Jewish tradition, saving one life is like saving the entire world. If the ship goes down, save a life and you've fulfilled the highest commandment of faith." Clark Poling told soldiers, "Faith without action is dead. When crisis comes, act, move, help, don't freeze, don't pray and wait, pray and work." Father Washington told Catholic soldiers, "The greatest love is laying down your life for your friends. Remember that if the worst happens, your courage can save others." On February 2nd, as the convoy approached Greenland, the escort commander broadcast a warning. U-boat activity had been detected in the area. All ships should maintain strict blackout conditions. All personnel should sleep in their clothes with life jackets accessible, and everyone should be prepared for possible attack. That night, most of the soldiers aboard the Dorchester went to sleep in their bunks wearing partial uniforms, with boots nearby and life jackets within reach, but some ignored the warning, removed uncomfortable gear, and slept in their underwear because they'd been at sea for 10 days without incident and assumed U-boats wouldn't attack a convoy this close to Greenland. The 4 chaplains made one final round of the troop decks before midnight, reminding men to keep life jackets accessible, reminding them of evacuation procedures, reminding them that if they heard explosions they should move immediately to their assigned lifeboat stations. Then the chaplains returned to their shared stateroom, said prayers in their different traditions, and prepared for sleep. At 12:55 on the morning of February 3, 1943, a torpedo from German U-boat U-223 struck the Dorchester on the starboard side, and everything the Chaplains had prepared for became terrifyingly real. The explosion was catastrophic. The torpedo hit below the waterline in the engine room area. The blast killed dozens of men instantly, knocked out all electrical power, and flooded compartments so rapidly that watertight doors couldn't be closed. Men in bunks near the explosion were killed by the blast or drowned in the sudden rush of seawater. Men in compartments further from the impact were thrown from their bunks by the concussion and plunged into darkness as the lights failed. The Dorchester immediately began listing to starboard as water flooded the damaged compartments. The list grew steeper by the second, making it difficult to stand, difficult to move through corridors, difficult to reach the ladders that led to the deck. Captain Danielson reached the bridge and immediately understood his ship was dying. The damage was too severe, the flooding too rapid. The Dorchester would sink in perhaps 20 minutes, maybe less. He ordered the evacuation signal, a series of short blasts on the ship's whistle that told everyone aboard to abandon ship, but with electrical power gone, the whistle was barely audible and many men below decks never heard it. In the troop compartments, chaos reigned. Men stumbled through pitch-black corridors trying to find their way to the deck. Men searched frantically for life jackets that had been stored in lockers now inaccessible in the dark. Men shoved and pushed in panic as the ship tilted further and water began flooding lower decks. The 4 chaplains emerged from their stateroom and immediately moved into action. Each had grabbed his life jacket, but instead of immediately putting it on and heading to the deck, they began moving through the corridors helping soldiers find their way. George Fox found a group of men trapped in a compartment where the door had jammed. He organized them to kick the door together, got it open, led them toward the ladder to the deck. Alexander Goode encountered soldiers who were frozen in panic, paralyzed by fear and darkness, unable to move. He grabbed them physically, shook them, ordered them in a voice that cut through their panic to follow him, and led them toward safety. Clark Poling found wounded men who'd been injured by the explosion, men with broken bones and burns who couldn't climb the ladders alone. He organized other soldiers to carry the wounded, created a human chain up the ladder to pass injured men to the deck. Father Washington moved through the flooded lower deck where water was rising rapidly, pulling men out of bunks where they'd been sleeping, pulling men out of rising water where they'd fallen and were too disoriented to save themselves. The chaplains worked separately but with the same mission: get men out of the interior compartments, get them to the deck, get them into lifeboats or into the water with life jackets. They also realized quickly that many men had no life jackets. Some had ignored the warning and left their jackets in storage. Some had been sleeping in compartments where life jacket lockers were now underwater or blocked by debris. Some had simply panicked and run for the deck without grabbing their jackets. Men without life jackets in 29-degree water would die in minutes. The jackets were the only thing that kept heads above water long enough for rescue ships to arrive. The chaplains reached the deck and found scenes of desperation. Lifeboats were being lowered, but several were frozen to their davits and couldn't be released. Rafts were being thrown overboard, but men were jumping into the water before securing life jackets, and dozens of soldiers were milling around the tilting deck looking for officers to tell them what to do. George Fox began organizing men into groups at each lifeboat station, assigning soldiers to help lower boats, assigning others to maintain order and prevent panic rushes that could capsize boats. Alexander Goode moved through the crowd looking for men without life jackets. When he found them, he directed them to the storage lockers where additional jackets might still be available. But the storage lockers were nearly empty. Hundreds of men needed life jackets and only dozens remained. The math was brutal and obvious. Many men would go into the water without jackets, and those men would die. Clark Poling was helping load a lifeboat when he saw a young soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, standing at the rail preparing to jump into the water without a life jacket. Poling grabbed the kid and asked where his jacket was. The soldier said he couldn't find it in the dark. His locker was flooded. He didn't know what to do. Poling didn't hesitate. He removed his own life jacket and put it on the soldier, tightened the straps, and told him to get in the lifeboat now. The soldier protested. "So you need your jacket?" Poling cut him off. "I'm giving you an order, soldier. Get in that lifeboat and survive. Tell my wife I did my duty." The soldier got in the lifeboat, and Clark Poling turned to help other men evacuate, now without the one piece of equipment that might have saved his life. Father Washington saw what Poling had done and immediately did the same, found a young Catholic soldier who was crying because he had no life jacket, gave the kid his own jacket, heard his confession right there on the deck, gave him absolution, and told him to live a good life in honor of the men who died that night. George Fox encountered a soldier who was about to jump into the water without a jacket, stopped him, removed his own life jacket, secured it on the soldier, and said, "God bless you, son, now swim for that raft and don't look back." Alexander Goode saw an enlisted man, a Jewish kid from Brooklyn, standing paralyzed with fear because he had no jacket and was certain he would die. Goode took off his own life jacket, put it on the soldier, quoted a line from Torah about saving lives, and pushed the kid toward a lifeboat. For chaplains, for life jackets given away, for men who now had no chance of survival in waters so cold it killed in minutes. And they didn't stop working, even after giving away their life jackets, even knowing they had just chosen death. They continued moving through the chaos, organizing evacuations, calming panicked men, helping wounded soldiers reach lifeboats, praying with men who knew they wouldn't survive. The Dorchester was settling deeper, the bow was underwater, the stern was rising out of the sea, lifeboats were pulling away with survivors, men were jumping into the water and swimming toward rafts, and the ship had perhaps 5 minutes before it would slip completely beneath the waves. The four chaplains moved toward each other, whether by plan or instinct. They came together at the stern of the ship as it tilted upward at an increasingly steep angle. Witnesses in lifeboats and rafts would later testify about what they saw in those final moments. For chaplains standing together on the sloping deck, each without a life jacket, each knowing death was seconds away, and choosing to spend those seconds together in prayer. George Fox was seen with his arm around Alexander Goode's shoulder. Clark Poling had his arm linked with Father Washington. The four men formed a line, standing together as the ship went down, praying in their different traditions, Methodist, Jewish, Dutch Reformed, Catholic, for voices raised together in faith as the North Atlantic closed over them. Multiple survivors reported hearing the chaplains singing. Some said it was a hymn, some said it was a prayer in Hebrew, some said it was just voices joined together in defiance of death, affirming faith in the face of destruction. At 1:18 on the morning of February 3, 1943, 23 minutes after the torpedo strike, the USAT Dorchester sank beneath the waves, and George Fox, Alexander Goode, Clark Poling, and John Washington went down with their ship, having chosen to die so that others could live. The water was 29 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill in 2 to 5 minutes depending on a person's size and physical condition. Men who entered the water without life jackets sank immediately or died of cold shock within seconds. Men who had life jackets floated in the darkness, screaming for help, trying to reach rafts or lifeboats, fighting the cold that numbed their bodies and clouded their minds. The two Coast Guard cutters that had been escorting the convoy, Comanche and Tampa, moved through the debris field rescuing survivors. Sailors threw lines to men in the water, pulled them aboard, carried them below deck where medics worked frantically to treat hypothermia and injuries. Of the 902 people aboard the Dorchester, 230 survived, 672 died, most from drowning or hypothermia, some from injuries sustained in the explosion, some from panic that caused them to make fatal mistakes during evacuation. Among the survivors were dozens of men who wore life jackets they hadn't owned when they boarded the Dorchester, life jackets that had been given to them by four chaplains who chose to die so others could live. Private William Bednar was one of those men. He was 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, and he'd been sleeping in his underwear when the torpedo hit because he'd ignored the warning about keeping his life jacket accessible. Bednar had panicked in the darkness, couldn't find his jacket, ran to the deck without it, was preparing to jump into the water and take his chances when a chaplain, he later learned it was Father Washington, grabbed him and put a life jacket on him. Bednar tried to protest, told the chaplain he needed his jacket. Washington told him shut up and get in the lifeboat. Bednar obeyed, and he was pulled from the water by the Coast Guard 40 minutes later, alive because a Catholic priest had given him a life jacket and a direct order. Private First Class John Mahoney was a Catholic kid from New York who'd attended Father Washington's Mass every Sunday of the voyage. He had his life jacket but gave it to another soldier who didn't, then ran back to find another jacket and found there were none left. He was standing on the deck accepting that he was going to die when George Fox approached him, asked if he had a jacket, learned he'd given his away, and immediately removed his own jacket and secured it on Mahoney. Mahoney protested. Fox told him that saving others is what faith means, told him to survive and live a good life. Mahoney survived and spent the rest of his life believing he was living on borrowed time given to him by a Methodist minister who died in his place. Private Daniel O'Connor was in a lifeboat that was being lowered when the ropes jammed. The boat hung suspended 20 feet above the water, ropes tangled, men inside panicking. O'Connor was trying to free the ropes when Clark Poling appeared above him. Poling had climbed down to the lifeboat level on the tilting ship, worked to untangle the ropes, got the boat lowered safely, then climbed back up to the deck. O'Connor called up asking if Poling needed help. Poling said, "No, son, you row away from here and don't look back." O'Connor survived, later learned that Poling had given away his life jacket minutes before climbing down to free that lifeboat, had chosen to save other men even after he'd already ensured his own death. Private Samuel Goldstein was a Jewish soldier who'd attended Alexander Goode's services throughout the voyage. He had his life jacket, but it was damaged, torn fabric, broken straps, wouldn't provide adequate flotation. Goode saw the damaged jacket, removed his own intact jacket, gave it to Goldstein, took the damaged jacket for himself. Goldstein survived, Goode did not, and for the rest of his life Goldstein kept that life jacket, the one Rabbi Goode had given him, as a reminder that a rabbi he'd known for 10 days valued his life more than his own. The survivors were transported to Greenland, treated for hypothermia and injuries, then eventually sent back to the United States. Many were reassigned to other units, some were medically discharged. All carried memories of February 3, 1943, that would never fade. They remembered the chaos and the terror, remembered the darkness and the cold, remembered men screaming in the water, remembered the ship going down, but most of all they remembered 4 chaplains who moved through disaster with calm purpose, who organized evacuations, who comforted the dying, who gave away their life jackets knowing it meant certain death, who stood together at the end singing prayers as the sea took them. In the weeks after the sinking, as survivors were debriefed and reports were compiled, a pattern emerged. Multiple survivors told the same story. They'd been given life jackets by chaplains, they'd been helped to lifeboats by chaplains, they'd been calmed and organized by chaplains. They'd survived because 4 men of faith had chosen service over survival. The Coast Guard compiled witness statements. At least 17 survivors specifically reported receiving life jackets from the chaplains. Dozens more reported being helped by the chaplains during evacuation, and multiple witnesses confirmed seeing the 4 chaplains standing together on the sinking ship, arms linked, praying. The story began to spread, first through military channels as after-action reports detailed what had happened aboard the Dorchester, then through newspapers as families of survivors wrote letters describing how their sons or husbands had been saved by chaplains who gave their life jackets. Then through churches as congregations learned about the ministers and rabbi and priest who had died serving their men. By spring of 1943, the 4 chaplains had become symbols of faith in action, of sacrifice that transcended denominational differences, of men who demonstrated through their final choices what they'd spent their lives preaching. But for the survivors who'd been there, who'd received those life jackets or been helped into lifeboats or been calmed by chaplains who then died, the 4 men weren't symbols. They were real people who'd made choices that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to honor. The families of the 4 chaplains received telegrams in February 1943 informing them that their husbands and fathers were missing in action following the sinking of the USAT Dorchester. The telegrams provided no details about how they died or what they'd done in their final moments. It wasn't until survivor letters began arriving, until debriefing reports were compiled and shared with families, that George Fox's wife, Alexander Goode's wife, Clark Poling's wife, and Father Washington's mother learned the full story of how their loved ones had died. Each family received letters from survivors, letters describing how the chaplains had given away their life jackets, how they'd helped evacuate the ship, how they'd stood together praying as the Dorchester sank, letters from soldiers who were alive because of those choices. Isadore Fox, George's wife, received a letter from Private Mahoney describing how George had given him a life jacket and told him to live a good life. The letter ended with Mahoney writing, "I'm alive because your husband valued my life more than his own. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of his sacrifice." Teresa Goode, Alexander's wife, received a letter from Private Goldstein describing how Rabbi Goode had taken his damaged life jacket and given him an intact one. Goldstein wrote, "Your husband died so I could live. I will teach my children about him. I will make sure his sacrifice is never forgotten." Betty Poling, Clark's wife, received a letter from Private O'Connor describing how Clark had freed their jammed lifeboat and then climbed back to the deck after he'd already given away his life jacket. O'Connor wrote, "Your husband saved my life twice that night. Once by giving his jacket to another man, once by making sure our boat got away safely." Mary Washington, Father John's mother, received a letter from Private Bednar describing how Father Washington had put a life jacket on him and ordered him into a lifeboat. Bednar wrote, "Your son died as a priest should die, saving lives and serving God to his last breath." The families grieved, but they also felt a measure of pride, knowing that their loved ones had died as they'd lived, serving others, demonstrating faith through action, choosing sacrifice over survival. In May 1943, the War Department officially declared the 4 chaplains killed in action. Memorial services were held at their home churches, and posthumous Purple Hearts were awarded to each man. But families and survivors felt that Purple Hearts weren't sufficient recognition. The chaplains hadn't died from enemy action in the traditional sense, they'd died from deliberate choices to give away survival equipment, and that deserved higher recognition. Survivors lobbied for the 4 chaplains to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. They collected affidavits from witnesses who'd seen the chaplains give away their life jackets. They documented the lives saved by those choices. They argued that deliberately choosing death to save others met the Medal of Honor criteria of conspicuous gallantry at risk of life. But there was a technical problem. The Medal of Honor could only be awarded for actions in combat against an enemy armed force. While the torpedo strike was certainly enemy action, the chaplains' choices to give away life jackets occurred during evacuation rather than during combat, and military lawyers argued this didn't meet the technical requirements. The application for Medals of Honor was denied in 1944, not because the chaplains' actions weren't worthy, but because existing regulations didn't have a category for non-combat sacrifice of this nature. Survivors and families were furious. The decision felt like bureaucracy dismissing heroism, like technical requirements mattering more than actual courage and sacrifice, but they kept pushing, kept lobbying Congress, kept telling the story of 4 men who'd chosen death to save lives. In 1948, Congress passed special legislation creating the Chaplains Medal for Heroism, a new decoration that could be awarded for extraordinary heroism by military chaplains. The medal was designed specifically to honor the 4 chaplains of the Dorchester and would never be awarded to anyone else. On January 18, 1961, the posthumous chaplains' medals were presented to the families of the 4 chaplains at a ceremony at Fort Myer, Virginia. Secretary of the Army Elvis Starr presented the medals and said that the 4 chaplains had demonstrated faith in its purest form, love that puts others before self, courage that chooses death to save life, unity that transcends denomination. The medal's design featured 4 figures standing together, representing the 4 chaplains, with the inscription "Greater love hath no man than this." Based on the Bible verse John 15 verse 13, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. The Chaplains Medal for Heroism remains the only military decoration ever created for specific individuals and never awarded again. It stands as unique recognition of unique sacrifice. But beyond medals and recognition, the 4 chaplains' story became a symbol of interfaith cooperation, of faith communities working together rather than competing, of recognizing that different traditions can share common values and common purpose. In 1951, the Chapel of 4 Chaplains was dedicated at Temple University in Philadelphia, an interfaith chapel honoring the memory of Fox, Goode, Poling, and Washington. The chapel featured stained glass windows depicting each chaplain and hosted interfaith services bringing together Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish congregations. Every year on February 3rd, interfaith memorial services were held at the chapel and at other locations around the country, services where ministers, rabbis, and priests stood together in memory of 4 men who'd stood together as their ship sank. The story was taught in Sunday schools and religious education classes. Children learned about the 4 chaplains as examples of faith in action, as proof that loving your neighbor meant being willing to die for strangers. In 1998, the U.S. Postal Service issued a 32-cent stamp honoring the 4 chaplains. The stamp showed the 4 men standing together on the sinking Dorchester, arms linked, A simple image that captured their final moments and their enduring legacy. But the most powerful recognition came not from government or institutions but from the survivors themselves, from the men who'd received life jackets and lived the rest of their lives knowing they existed because someone else had chosen to die. In February 1998, 55 years after the sinking of the Dorchester, the remaining survivors held what they knew would be their final reunion. Of the 230 men who'd survived that night in 1943, only 12 were still alive in 1998. The reunion was held in Philadelphia, at the chapel of 4 chaplains, 12 old men, all in their 70s and 80s, some in wheelchairs, some using walkers, all carrying memories of one night when they'd been young soldiers facing death in freezing water. Private William Bednar was there, 74 years old. He'd lived in Pennsylvania his entire life after the war, worked as a machinist, raised 4 children, attended Catholic Mass every Sunday, and never forgot that he existed because Father Washington had given him a life jacket. Private First Class John Mahoney was there, 77 years old. He'd returned to New York after the war, worked as a police officer for 30 years, and kept a photograph of George Fox on his desk at home, the Methodist minister who died so a Catholic kid could live. Private Daniel O'Connor was there, 76 years old. He'd become a teacher after the war, taught history in New Jersey high schools, and every year on February 3rd he'd tell his students about Clark Poling, the minister who climbed down to free a jammed lifeboat after giving away his own life jacket, the man who'd told O'Connor to row away and not look back. Private Samuel Goldstein was there, 75 years old. He'd survived the war, become a rabbi himself serving a Reform congregation in Massachusetts, and every Yom Kippur he'd tell his congregation about Alexander Goode, the rabbi who'd given him a life jacket and taught him what it meant to value another person's life above your own. The 12 survivors gathered in the chapel, surrounded by the stained glass windows depicting the 4 chaplains, and for 3 hours they told stories they'd been telling for 55 years but somehow never grew old because the stories were true and the truth mattered. They told about the explosion at 12:55, about the chaos in the darkness, about the chaplains moving through the corridors organizing evacuations, about the moment each of them had encountered a chaplain who'd changed the course of their life. Bednar described Father Washington putting that life jacket on him with hands that were firm and certain, described the priest's voice giving him a direct order to get in the lifeboat, described realizing hours later that Washington had died because he'd given away the one thing that might have saved him. Mahoney described George Fox's face when he gave him the life jacket, described how Fox had smiled and said saving others is what faith means, described how that sentence had shaped every decision Mahoney made for the rest of his life, every time he'd helped someone, every time he'd sacrificed convenience or comfort to serve another person, he'd thought about George Fox and tried to be worthy of the gift he'd been given. O'Connor described watching Clark Poling climb back up to the deck after freeing their lifeboat, described seeing Poling help other men even though he had no life jacket, described the last words Poling had said to him, "You row away from here and don't look back." But O'Connor had looked back, had watched the ship sink, had seen the 4 chaplains standing together at the stern. Goldstein described Alexander Goode taking his damaged life jacket and giving him an intact one, described Goode quoting Torah about saving lives, described understanding in that moment that his rabbi believed the commandment to save life was more important than his own survival, and Goldstein had spent 55 years as a rabbi trying to teach others what Goode had taught him. The survivors shared something else too, guilt, survivors' guilt that had haunted them for 55 years, the weight of knowing they were alive because someone else had died, the burden of trying to live lives worthy of the sacrifice that had saved them. Bednar said he'd spent 55 years wondering if Father Washington had made the right choice, wondering if he'd done enough with his life to justify another man dying for him, wondering if anything he'd accomplished was worth what Washington had given up. Mahoney said he'd struggled with the same questions, had tried to be a good cop, had tried to help people, had tried to raise his kids to value service and sacrifice, but he'd always wondered if it was enough, if anything could be enough to balance the equation of George Fox dying so he could live. O'Connor said he'd become a teacher specifically because he wanted to pass on what Clark Poling had taught him, that service means acting even when action costs you everything, and he'd taught thousands of students about the 4 chaplains hoping that their story would inspire others to choose courage over comfort. Goldstein said becoming a rabbi had been his way of honoring Alexander Goode, his way of continuing the work Goode would have done if he'd survived, and every time he counseled someone through grief or fear, every time he helped someone find meaning in suffering, he felt like he was channeling the rabbi who'd died in his place. The survivors also talked about how the 4 chaplains' sacrifice had changed their understanding of faith, how seeing men of different religions choose death together had taught them that faith was about shared humanity rather than theological differences. Several of the survivors had been raised in households where other religions were viewed with suspicion or hostility, where Catholics didn't trust Protestants, where Christians didn't understand Jews, where denominational identity was a source of division. But watching 4 chaplains of different faiths stand together praying as their ship sank had demolished those prejudices, had shown them that when death is immediate and certain, the differences between Methodist and Catholic and Dutch Reformed and Jewish don't matter. What matters is the shared belief that some things are worth dying for. Mahoney, who'd been raised Catholic and taught that Protestants were wrong about faith, said that George Fox's sacrifice had shown him that God didn't care about denomination, that a Methodist minister giving his life for a Catholic kid proved that faith was about love and action, not about which church you attended or what creed you recited. Goldstein, who'd experienced anti-Semitism and felt like an outsider in a predominantly Christian military, said that the 3 Christian chaplains standing with Rabbi Goode in those final moments had shown him that Judaism and Christianity shared the same core belief, that love of neighbor meant willingness to die for strangers regardless of their faith. The reunion lasted 3 hours, 12 old men who'd been given life by 4 men who'd chosen death, gathering one final time to remember and honor and try once more to answer the question that had haunted them for 55 years. What do you do with a life you didn't earn, a life given to you by someone else's sacrifice? The answer they'd all arrived at, in different ways and through different paths, was that you live it for others, you serve, you help, you sacrifice when you can, you try to pass on the gift you were given by being the kind of person who gives rather than takes. At the end of the reunion, the 12 survivors stood together in front of the stained glass windows depicting the 4 chaplains, and they recited the prayer that had become associated with the chaplain's memory, a prayer written by a minister in 1948 that captured the essence of what Fox, Goode, Poling, and Washington had demonstrated. O God, whose beloved Son took upon himself the form of a servant, help us to follow the example of George Fox, Alexander Goode, Clark Poling, and John Washington, who gave themselves in service to others and laid down their lives for their friends. May we who honor their memory be inspired by their sacrifice. May we who remember their courage find strength in our own trials. May we who tell their story live lives worthy of their example, in faith, in service, and in love for all humankind. The survivors embraced, knowing this was likely the last time they would see each other, knowing their generation was passing, knowing the first-hand memories of that night in 1943 would soon exist only in written records and recorded interviews. But they also knew the story would survive, knew it would continue to be told, knew that as long as people needed reminders about courage and faith and sacrifice, someone would remember 4 chaplains standing together on a sinking ship, having given away their life jackets, choosing to die so others could live. William Bednar died in 2001 at age 77, John Mahoney died in 2003 at age 82, Daniel O'Connor died in 2005 at age 83, Samuel Goldstein died in 2006 at age 83. Each of them was buried with military honors. Each funeral included readings about the 4 chaplains. Each obituary mentioned that they were survivors of the Dorchester and owed their lives to chaplains who died in their place. And each of them had lived lives of service, had raised families, had contributed to their communities, had passed on the story of 4 men whose final act had given them everything that came after. By 2010, all 12 survivors from the 1998 reunion had died, the last first-hand witnesses to what happened aboard the Dorchester on February 3, 1943, were gone, but they'd left behind testimonies, recorded interviews, written accounts, and children and grandchildren who carried the story forward. The story of the 4 chaplains remains relevant 75 years after the Dorchester sank because it addresses questions that never stop being important. What does faith mean when everything is at stake? How do we demonstrate love for others when love requires sacrifice? How do different religious traditions find common ground in shared values? The 4 chaplains answered those questions through their final choices. Faith means acting to save others even when action guarantees your own death. Love means giving away your life jacket to a stranger because his life matters as much as yours, and different religious traditions find common ground in the fundamental belief that some things are worth dying for. Their story has been taught in military chaplain training programs for 8 decades as the defining example of chaplaincy in action, as proof that chaplains serve not by staying safe but by being present in the moment of crisis and choosing their men over themselves. Every Army chaplain, Navy chaplain, and Air Force chaplain learns about Fox, Goode, Poling, and Washington, learns about the choice they made, learns that chaplaincy sometimes requires laying down your life for your soldiers and sailors. The story has been taught in seminary programs across denominations as an example of interfaith cooperation, as proof that theological differences don't prevent common action when action is required to save lives. Protestant seminaries teach about George Fox and Clark Poling. Catholic seminaries teach about Father John Washington. Rabbinical schools teach about Alexander Goode, but all of them teach the same lesson, that faith communities are strongest when they work together rather than compete. The Chapel of Four Chaplains in Philadelphia continues to host interfaith services, bringing together ministers, rabbis, priests, and imams to remember 4 men who demonstrated that faith transcends denomination. The chapel has become a symbol of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, a place where different religious communities gather to celebrate shared values. February 3rd has been designated as Four Chaplains Day in some states, a day to remember the sacrifice and to promote interfaith understanding. Schools hold assemblies, churches hold services, veterans organizations hold memorial gatherings, all focused on remembering 4 men who stood together when death came. The story has been depicted in films, documentaries, books, and articles, each retelling emphasizing different aspects but all capturing the core narrative of 4 chaplains giving away their life jackets and standing together praying as their ship sank. In 2011, the United States Navy commissioned a ship named USNS Worthy, a Bob Hope-class vehicle cargo ship, and designated it in honor of the 4 chaplains. The ship's crest features 4 figures standing together, representing Fox, Goode, Poling, and Washington. Every sailor who serves aboard that ship learns the story of why their vessel carries that name. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy isn't found in memorials or ceremonies or official recognition. It's found in the lives changed by the story, in people who hear about 4 chaplains giving away life jackets and decide to live differently. Teachers who tell the story to students and watch those students begin to think about service and sacrifice. Ministers and rabbis and priests who preach about the 4 chaplains and see congregation members inspired to help others. Military personnel who hear the story and understand that service sometimes requires everything you have. The story works because it's simple and clear, no ambiguity, no complexity, just 4 men who had life jackets and gave them to men who didn't, knowing with absolute certainty that this meant death. No one can hear that story and wonder whether Fox, Goode, Poling, and Washington were heroes. The choice they made defines heroism. No one can question whether their sacrifice mattered. 17 soldiers who received those life jackets survived and lived full lives because of those choices. And no one can miss the lesson, that faith is demonstrated through action, that love of neighbor means willingness to die for strangers, that different religious traditions share fundamental beliefs about the value of human life and the importance of sacrifice for others. The 4 chaplains teach us something we desperately need to remember in an era of religious division and sectarian conflict, that people of different faiths can stand together, can work together, can die together in service of shared values that transcend theological differences. George Fox the Methodist, Alexander Goode the rabbi, Clark Poling the Dutch Reformed minister, and John Washington the Catholic priest stood together on that sinking ship because they knew something more important than their denominational differences. They knew that loving your neighbor means being willing to give your life so your neighbor can live. And they acted on that knowledge, removed their life jackets, gave them away, and stood together praying in their different traditions as the sea took them, for men, for faiths, one sacrifice, one lesson that still echoes across 75 years. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. The 4 chaplains lived that verse, demonstrated it with absolute clarity, and created a legacy that challenges every generation to ask what they would do in the same situation. Would you give away your life jacket? Would you choose certain death to save a stranger? Would you stand with people of different faiths united in common purpose? Would you demonstrate through your final act that love means sacrifice? The four chaplains answered yes to all those questions, and their answer resonates because we know it was real, not theoretical heroism or hypothetical courage, but actual men making actual choices in actual crisis, choosing others over self, choosing death over life, choosing faith over fear. That's why the story endures, that's why it still matters, that's why 75 years after the Dorchester sank, people still remember four chaplains standing together on the stern, arms linked, praying as the waves closed over them, having given away the one thing that might have saved them because they believed with absolute certainty that other lives mattered as much as their own.